Hey, welcome back to Acre Talk Podcast. This is Dale. So glad that you're with me today.
Deep in the shadows, I know it's hard to put one foot in front of the other. So far as the echo, where do we start? You can learn to discover a million.
So I hope that you have had a stupendous time of it, and I hope that you have survived the polar vortex that has happened this week. All of the Midwest, pretty much most of the country, had suffered from the polar vortex this week. Record low temperatures, parts of the country that never get down into these single digits or even sub-zero temperature suffered it this week. And while we were all huddled up trying to keep warm in our homes, what was on many of our minds is within a month or so, we should be in the garden. We should be planting things in the garden. Studies show that 25% of U.S. citizens garden. Out of that 25%, only 15% of that garden for vegetables. The rest are gardening as flowers or shrubbery or things along that line, ornamental gardening. So when you start talking about such low numbers in our society, it tends to show that many of us are relying on the grocery store or big commercial vegetable gardening. Now, with that being such a high number, that's when we fall into all of these scares when we have a outbreak of bacteria or some health concern. But blaringly obvious to all of us was during the pandemic of 2020 that our food supply is very vulnerable. When we went to grocery stores that had empty shelves everywhere of fresh, healthy food, alternatives to eat, it was obvious the U.S. has a problem. That problem is we become too distanced from our past, too distanced from the family farm, too distanced even in the urban home front of raising a majority of our own food in the form of vegetables and fresh food. Not to mention the fact that we have been generationals deep of people who not only don't raise their own food, but then when they do raise that garden in the back of the home, in the front yards, in the container gardens of their porches, window sills, whatever, they have no inkling, no clue, and are so drastically uneducated on how to put that food up and store it for a later date. So many have gardened or fell into the garden fad, but yet they're still just eating those vegetables fresh with yet waste. Or have fell under the curtain of the fad of planting this seed or that seed for some food stuff that they don't even eat. All of that being said, the one thing that 2020 and the pandemic did for this nation is brought that awareness to the forefront. Thus was born the homestead movement. Many channels like 9 Acre, Family Farms, Justin Rhodes, Roots and Refuge, many other channels, social media platforms became full of homesteading and regenerative farming channels. People who are willing to spread their knowledge to the public of ways that were long forgotten by our grandparents and our great-great-grandparents. Of a time when our country, when we go back to the 60s or 70s, was more along the lines of 3/4 of the population or more were raising their own vegetables. Majority of their food was coming from their own working hands. Oh, how the days of stability in this country have left us. Now, with that growth and that movement, we have seen great changes happen within that small, roughly 20% of the population. They are blaringly aware. They have educated themselves fully on the fact that they will no longer be dependent upon the almighty grocery store. Now, many of us flirt with the gardening. We do just enough to say that we garden. Yet others have taken it extremely seriously. Whether you are one of these flirters or you become the crazy gardener, the one thing that is obvious, we must share with others. And by share, I don't even mean in the bounty. Although there is nothing more wonderful than to share your harvest with a neighbor, with that less fortunate person, just to spread that influence. Much like Christians, and you all know that I have to bring my Christianity into this talk, but we must spread that word to others. We must share in the wealth, as it all comes from the Almighty. Now, that share of that bountiful harvest may influence others. But yet, if we continually share with everyone under the sun, are we helping or are we hurting? Because if it is a constant supply of your over and abundance to them, will they ever learn to supply for themselves? One of those pending questions. So as we start talking about gardening, one thing that must be done is we must decide on an area. We must evaluate our microclimate. Our area that we have our little piece of Eden of where we can start our own growth. Now, whether you are gardening directly in ground or you are starting a raised bed garden is dependent upon your own health, your own preference, and your soil condition. Many of us have spent time in an in-ground garden. Others, like ourselves, started an in-ground garden, but have migrated to the raised bed world. I know for me, if I'm going to have to crawl around on the ground, I'm probably not going to spend a lot of time with it. But if I can have a raised bed, I will spend way more time in the garden. So our next talk next week when we come back, we will spend time talking about the in-ground versus raised bed gardens. And until then, ponder on all the things that we've talked about. Are you part of the 25%? Are you wanting to be part of that 25%? To spawn a change in this world and pass it on to the next generation? Or are you like many others and will become the quintessential ostrich with his head in the sand, blind to what you're being fed? Till next time, farm on. Keep strong. We love you. And so does God.